Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1212th New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alison Hokanson, Joanna Seidenstein, and Jason Rosenfeld. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Alison Hokanson is the curator in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A specialist in 19th century Northern European and British painting, she has curated and co-curated many exhibitions at the Met, most recently Caspar David Friedrich, The Soul of Nature, the topic of today's conversation. Joanna Seidenstein is assistant curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In this role, she holds responsibility for Northern European drawings and prints from the Renaissance to the end of the 19th century. She has curated and co-curated many exhibitions at the Met, including Caspar David Friedrich, The Soul of Nature. And our host today, distinguished chair and professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College, Dr. Jason Rosenfeld, has curated the exhibitions John Everett Millay, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, and River Crossings. He is the co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. Jason's upcoming book on Shazia Sikander will be published by Lond Humphreys in November. And with that, I will pass it over to Jason to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magali. Welcome, Joanna and Allison.
We're happy to be here. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today on this beautiful Earth Day when we will celebrate one of the greatest ever painters of the landscape in Western art history, Caspar David Friedrich. Just a few thank yous to Magali, of course, and also Min, Chloe, and Fong at the Rail for all their help today. Joanna, Allison, of course, Sarah, and the rest of the team in communications at the Met for facilitating all this and getting us some nice slides. Today we're going to launch right in. Allison has to leave us at 2 o'clock to get to Citi Field for the Mets Phillies game. No, she has some kind of a meeting, and I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to share the screen. There you go. Couple Met Instagram addresses that you should follow, Met European Paintings, and also Met Drawings and Prints, which is always entertaining. These are the departments that house our distinguished curators today. Mine you can look at if you're bored. Caspar David Friedrich, The Soul of Nature. You don't have much time. It closes on May 11th. It cannot be extended because all of Germany, all of unified Germany wants their pictures and drawings back. So there's no other opportunity. This is your last chance in a generation, maybe two, to see some of these pictures on American shores. It's unlikely to ever happen again. Part of the reason why it came about, I learned at the press preview, is that last year was the 250th anniversary of Friedrich's birth. And so Germany had numerous exhibitions showing almost everything in various locations. And this gave the Met a little bit of an opening, an opportunity to borrow some things temporarily for 3 short months the year after, when there was a little bit of Friedrich fatigue, although the Germans won't admit it. So we are fortunate to have it. Please get there. And please remember, as I always forget, that the Met is closed on Wednesday. Do not show up. You won't be able to get in.
But open late on Fridays and Saturdays.
Late on Fridays and Saturdays. And if you're a New Yorker, you don't have to pay much if you don't want to. But you should support the greatest art institution in America. Anybody want to read this? Either of you? I thought we'd start with some of Friedrich's own words.
Joanna, do you want to take it?
Sure, happy to. So this is something Friedrich wrote as part of a manuscript he produced around 1830, toward the end of his career. The artist's task is not the faithful representation of air, water, rocks, and trees, but rather his soul, his sensations should be reflected in them. The task of a work of art is to recognize the spirit of nature, and with one's whole heart and intention to saturate oneself with it and absorb it and give it back again in the form of a picture.
You see that as a kind of manifesto written later in his life. And we'll talk about some of the late work at the end of today. But sort of looking back and thinking about it, the spirit of nature, and of course the idea of the soul of nature, which is the title that you're using for this exhibition. So maybe give us a short potted history of our man Caspar David Friedrich. Here are two self-portraits, 10 years apart, once he started to grow facial hair on the right. The one on the left is in the exhibition. So maybe Alison,
Joanna, do
just
you want
a
to
very
kick?
short potted
Yeah.
history of
All
Friedrich.
right, Joanna, do you want to at least kick this off?
Yeah,
Sure, sure.
whichever.
So Friedrich was born in 1774 in what is now northern Germany. What was at the time one of many aristocratic territories, all separate from one another politically. And he trains there and then in Copenhagen at the Royal Danish Academy for 4 years, training that is entirely focused on drawing the human figure in line with very long tradition of classical artistic pedagogy. But then he makes the decision to return to the German lands and settle in the city of Dresden in Saxony in the east. And this is a flourishing artistic center with wonderful art collections, beautiful landscapes surrounded by mountains and countryside. And this is where he is exposed to early romantic ideas that are beginning to circulate more widely in the region. He spends basically his entire career there in Dresden, though making frequent sketching expeditions in the surrounding region and also back along the Baltic coast near his birthplace, so Greifswald. And what unfolds is, as you said, Jason, one of the most striking, distinctive, and important bodies of landscape paintings and drawings in the history of European art. And, although he will fade from public view toward the end of his life and be virtually forgotten at his death in 1840, he's rediscovered in the late 19th, early 20th century, and has had considerable fame, at least in Germany, where he's really a household name and probably, one of the most, if not the most beloved artists.
And there are 5 paintings in America, am I correct? That's right?
That's right.
5 oil paintings. I mean, there are drawings, prints, etc., but only 5 oil paintings in America. There are not that many in private collections. It's not likely to rise that much higher. Either you go to the Met by May 11th, or you have to go to Central Europe, Germany, to see his stuff. The drawings, I think, are quite wonderful. The self-portraits, the one on the left, looks kind of straightforward in a way, but Joanna writes beautifully about it in the catalog, which I urge everyone to buy, which is a serious piece of scholarship with multiple essays and excellent catalog entries by both Alison and Joanna and colleagues from Germany, about the way that he uses the pencil and or the black chalk and the touch in making this. And the one on the right is the image which we always kind of show in class. I always show in class because it feels like it has a little bit more of that romantic wildness, right? He's wearing monk's robes. He's a little lower on the page. He's looking up. Of course, that makes sense if you're drawing yourself on a piece of paper and you're constantly looking down and then back up at a mirror. But he seems to have a little bit of that, crazy hair, big mutton chops, this kind of thing, which we associate with these sort of hermetic landscape painters, which of course he was not. He was not. I just want to start with talking about the installation for a minute. The concept behind the visual look of the installation, which is on the first level of the Met. Maybe talk a little, just for a minute, about that.
Yeah, we worked with a great design team headed up by Maru Perez, who was our exhibition designer, and Sarah Polverenti, who was our graphic designer. They work in-house at the Met under Alicia Cheng, who's the head of our design studio, and they were involved in the exhibition conception very early in the process. We started a dialogue with them. They looked at very early iterations of the checklist. They probably saw it before almost anybody else. And through talking with them, we drew out formal aspects of the work, themes in the work that could be amplified through the exhibition design. And we also talked about the narrative that we wanted to create of these works and how that could be enhanced through the exhibition design. So in a number of cases, we've built vistas where you can stand in one space and look through to another space, and see the paintings or the drawings that are coming up. And the idea there is, of course, to cue this visual experience that one has looking at an individual Caspar David Friedrich composition where you're standing, on the threshold of the verge, looking out, gazing out towards the horizon. And the other thing that this exhibition design does is also to knit together the various phases of his career, because he was an artist who looped back on himself. He would return to themes, to compositions, sometimes even to sketches that he had made decades after they were first composed. And so it also allows us to jump chronology a little bit.
And they're working with fairly low light levels in some cases because productively you have multiple media in each room. So drawings, watercolors, along with oils. That way you can really see the kind of progress in his career and also, the change in his technique and style as he gets older.
Yeah, and that dialogue is really important because he
Yeah.
starts out as a draftsman. I mean, he first makes his name, he comes onto the scene as this romantic talent, making works on paper. That is also how he ends his career. And throughout his entire career, he's making not only sketches from nature, as we see here, but finished compositions, not only in oil, but also in wash and in watercolor. And that dialogue is really central to his work. Even when he's a painter, we know from the underdrawings he's still a draftsman. And so as a co-curated exhibition, that was an aspect of his work that we really wanted to highlight.
I thought that was pretty fascinating. People can see in the last room two unfinished oils, which I'm not going to show you today, but where you can see how he actually drew quite meticulously on the canvas, and then he subsumes all that in the painting. And the quote that Joanna read earlier, he talks about the artist's task is not the faithful representation of air, water, rocks, and trees. But the early drawings, of course, are aiming at a kind of faithful representation, like you see here in these sketches, using the whole of the page, dating it precisely June 28th, 1799, and then using these as aide-memoirs for the rest of his life in order to make pictures which were much more elegant. But I was fascinated by this one sheet and, that ease of drawing, kind of connecting with the foliage and understanding it. This is, of course, something that Gainsborough did, other artists did, but learning how to use wash, like you see here in this impossibly close detail of these banks of trees. But then maybe Joanna talk about what happens within only a couple of years, and he produces something like this, which is just one of the most beautiful ink and wash drawings over pencil anyone ever created, and fairly large scale also, what we call in British circles exhibition watercolor. View of Arcona with Rising Moon from 1805, 1806. I'll let you talk about this a little bit, Joanna.
Yeah, so just briefly about the sketches, he really continues making sketches throughout his career, though by 1804, using pencil quite consistently and making what are really almost like portraits of individual trees and rocks. It was very important to get that specificity and individuality of each natural form. And so he used these drawings, as you said, sometimes years later, but it was also that experience of being outside, observing from nature, seeing light shifting across surfaces, developing the sensitivity for atmosphere and vantage point that then come to fruition in finished works like this one, which is indeed an exhibition piece. It was exhibited at the Dresden Academy in 1806. And it was with works like this, as Alison said, that Friedrich first made his name as an artist in the art scene in Dresden. So this is an ink wash drawing, most likely sepia ink, which is the secretion of the cuttlefish, the actual sea creature, a kind of ink that had been in long, if sporadic, use in the Mediterranean, but had only recently been introduced in artistic circles in Dresden and was beginning to be marketed there. And it's a very rich, slow-drying ink, and many artists gravitated to it. But what Friedrich does with it really is remarkable. The incredible control he has. So you get that subtle transition from the light, thank you, that's beautiful detail, light above the horizon towards the darker part of the sky, and then the moon rising above the horizon, and its reflections in the water. That's actually the untouched paper, what we call the reserve. So areas where he didn't let any ink touch those passages. But there's so much detail. There's incredible finesse in terms of how he handles it. And then we don't see it, it's largely obscured, but also that same kind of underdrawing, meticulous underdrawing is present in these works as well. And so critics were dazzled by the technique, by the technical virtuosity that works like this exhibited, but also by the feeling, by the mood that these works evoke, often, as in this case, in the complete absence of figures. And one thing we like to point out with this work is that this is actually a very specific view, a recognizable view, so different from many of Friedrich's landscapes, which are more amalgamations and inventions, if ultimately grounded in the observation of specific trees and plants. But this is the northernmost point on the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea, so not far from Friedrich's hometown, where he had spent a considerable amount of time making sketches. And it is a site where that was known for a prominent Lutheran pastor's shore sermons, where he delivered sermons for fisher folk unable to attend church because of their work being so tied to the cycles of nature. And one of the things I think is so interesting is that, Friedrich doesn't show that at all. And you can imagine if he had, that it would almost be sort of distracting and take away from the feeling in the landscape. But he may well allude to it with the empty boats in disuse, and there's a tiny fence on one of the rocky promontories at left. And it's certainly something that many of his contemporaries would have known about. So he chooses a site embedded with spiritual associations, a religious practice that is fully enmeshed in the natural world. It takes place in nature, and again, is for people whose work is tied to the cycles of nature.
Yeah. And that sort of glow is a kind of glow of both spirituality and fog. Very difficult to paint fog. Who does it? Turner, I guess. Other artists who this reminds me of a little bit is Francis Town, not very well known British watercolorist who has a similar kind of quality, although not monochromatic. And then it makes me think of Peter Balke, who Alison did an exhibit on at the Met many years ago now, I guess. This sort of Nordic sensibility in these pictures. And then at the same time, he's evolving, of course, his oil paintings into works like these, which we think of as the great masterpieces of his maturity, Wander Above the Sea of Fog, which is ubiquitous everywhere, used on all the promotional materials, fridge magnets. I have one in the other room, posters, banners, etc. And then Monk by the Sea, which is my personal favorite. I wrote a piece for the March issue of the Brooklyn Rail series we call One by One, where you work on one work about Monk by the Sea and my history with it. It's the first time I was ever able to see it was when the show opened in February. A very moving experience. But the way that Joanna's talking about the previous work, there is a kind of level of spirituality in these pictures, which is really critical. So, maybe talk a little bit, Alice, in terms of the oils of what he's doing that's distinctive in oil painting.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And just one point, which is that the
Yep.
Petar Balka exhibition was actually curated by my colleague Asher
Oh,
Miller. So all full credit to him.
my
And
bad. I'm
Balka was
confusing it with the
actually
Turner one, Turner whale subject.
the student of one of Caspar David Friedrich's good friends. So there's a connection, if not actually a through line there.
Okay. Apologies,
So
Asher.
Friedrich makes his debut as an oil painter several years after he's established himself with these ink wash drawings. And he has a gift for self-promotion. He plants articles in the newspaper about the fact that, he's now working in oils, exhibiting in oils. And when he starts to paint in oil, he almost immediately starts to take advantage of and to explore the expressive possibilities afforded by oil paint and the representation of light, of color, and of atmosphere, these effects of cloud and mist. And he manipulates them in an incredibly subtle way. You really need to stand in front of these pictures to appreciate the delicacy of the light effects and the delicate layering of paint that creates this effect of both transparency and translucency, this dialogue between those effects on the one hand and opacity on the other. The Monk by the Sea was incredibly radical for its time. In part simply because of its formal minimalism, which is still so striking today, and also because of its open-endedness and its narrative simplicity. And all of those things go hand in hand. But a painting in 1810 was supposed to convey a moral message or tell a story or at least elicit a specific emotional response. But The Monk by the Sea, by virtue of its emptiness, becomes open to interpretation. Its meanings need to be completed by the viewer with their own thoughts and their own emotions. That is, for the period, a very innovative conception, both of what a painting should look like and also what a painting should be, how it should affect the viewer. And there's a famous quotation, a critical response to this painting when it was first exhibited, where a reviewer says that it lies there like the apocalypse, and that looking at it is as if your eyelids had been cut off. Very characteristic German Romantic understatement. But the idea there is that it challenges the viewer, provokes this kind of existential crisis because there's so little to anchor us, pardon the pun, or orient us within the picture. And in The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which we think was done almost a decade later, Friedrich has expanded his pictorial vocabulary. We've now traveled up into the mountains, which in the Romantic era were newly appreciated as these sites of beauty and of grandeur, where you could really experience the immense power and the immense age of the earth, right? This is when we talk about the romantic sublime, this is the type of experience that we are discussing. And Friedrich combines these elements, the solid rock, evanescent mist, and then the figure of the wanderer to suggest that type of experience, to involve the viewer in it and to provoke our own response. And I think that the figure of, in both cases really, but particularly in The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, this centrally placed figure seen from behind, this Rückenfigur, really emphasizes the idea of an individual response to nature and an individual response to an artwork, because we cannot see what he sees. We cannot know what he is feeling. He has an internal drama that is separate from our own. And so in looking at this picture, we have to contend with the fact that no one's experience of this painting will be exactly the same, that, sort of by its nature, it is multifaceted in what it may mean.
So that's wonderful descriptions of these works and a lot of things to unpack, which we are going to do now sequentially. Thank you for that whole setup. But these paintings, it's so rare that artists settle on iconic works, like sort of iconic works that set a visual stage for the future. I mean, if you think of Delacroix, you probably think of Liberty Leading the People, as a kind of iconic work and composition. But these two works, the near and the far, in a sense, the human experience, are in that realm. And part of the beauty of the installation is how often, and I will show many more of these kinds of images, people can be seen looking at these works. And the vistas that you get. So I took this on Saturday. Two little kids who are lost in it, right? And then the couple on the right, maybe they're millennial parents, who knows? But the idea of people sort of looking at this and moving around it or making way for it, in the way that he's come through and is looking at this view. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but this idea of looking and, as Alison said, a wholly new way of thinking about looking is very much a part of what Friedrich is innovating in this period. So, before we get to a 25-minute discussion of German 18th century theologians, no, I'm joking. You can find that in the catalog. I want to do a little run through the idea of the Rückenfigur. So, Rückenfigur, Alison, you mentioned, what is that concept?
So that is, as I mentioned, these figures seen from behind in landscape paintings. Friedrich does not invent this motif.
No.
They have a long history in landscape painting as secondary figures who, through their gestures, draw the viewer into the landscape and encourage us to engage in this imaginary journey through the terrain. Friedrich really makes that motif his own, and as you can see in something like the Wanderer, he really literally makes the Rückenfigur central to the experience of the landscape. They become a real psychological presence
Yeah.
that we contend with in the scene and highlight this experience of contemplate, whether that's contemplation of nature or contemplation of the work of art.
And he uses these rock formations to kind of enhance that quality verticality in the figure. Quite clever.
Yep.
Rückenfigur literally means back figure in German. So let's spin through some Rückenfigures that have been impacted by Friedrich. First, of course, Robert Pattinson as Edward Cullen in the Twilight Saga, Eclipse 2010. I mean, who could imagine what's going through his brain here as he remains obsessed by Bella? And of course, because he's a vampire, the idea of the rising sun, which poses a great problem for him and his pasty white skin. I got a lot of these, and if you want to comment on them, please feel free to go ahead. But from the low of the Twilight Saga to Tarkovsky's Mirror, which is one of my favorite Russian films, which is all about memory, history, and motherhood. And this image of the woman sitting on the fence, looking out into the pastures. But the idea that you see her from behind, it inhabits a whole realm of memory, which this is in the beginning of the film. You don't even know about yet. But then you also see those poles with their electric lines, right? So we're not in the distant past, though we could be in a sense, but we're in fact, and the orthogonals of those poles leading to the future. Such a freighted image, but it made more powerful because you don't see her, right? Much more importantly, I know this is right up your Alison's alley. Game of Thrones, one of the great scenes ever in Game of Thrones. Do you want to comment on this? Jon Snow and Ygritte having scaled the wall in season 3, episode 6, and looking at the view of the southern lands from on top of the wall. Something which will lead to incredible amounts of conflict. This is what happens, I think you'll agree, as an art historian. You're watching something on TV and you see something, and then you just start whooping and hollering, saying, I know exactly where that comes from. Take a screenshot, show it in class, and the students are like, you really have a problem. But it's a good problem to have, right?
Well, yeah, and I think it illustrates how deeply the language that Friedrich and his contemporaries invented 200 years ago in this relatively small corner of Europe has penetrated into first their own visual culture and now our popular culture. And the extent to which we are still living with the visual, first of all, his visual language, but also what underlies that. We're still
Yeah.
living in some ways with this romantic sense of our relationship with nature, our relationship with the natural world.
And the ability to insert yourself into character destinies. I mean, that's such an important part of fiction, and especially something he couldn't have imagined, which was film. It's so essential to the meaning of these works. And then
Yes.
it's taken up by modernists. The last shot of Aventura, one of my favorite movies, and Antonioni, the scene of Monica Vitti, who just died a couple years ago, and Gabriele Ferretti, where Antonioni has played with the formula, right? He's bifurcated the composition where the right is just a wall, which symbolizes his emotional state. He's now the one who needs taken care of, and his destiny is super uncertain and not visible. And she's staring off into the distant volcanic peak. An incredible shot by Antonioni, and I think something that complicates the whole idea, and then is taken up by Scorsese in this shot from Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, where Ellen Burstyn's character, who's on the hunt seeking a partner in life, has gone through all kinds of travails, and then standing outside of this tawdry, bar slash packy, just confronted by a wall. And you sense her emotional state, but you also see the desperation of her plight. I think this is a kind of twist on it in a
Yeah,
sense.
and I think it shows also how flexible that particular composition
Mm,
is. And it has been the source, for better or for worse, for many different creative reappropriations. We trace some of those in the catalog, not only in cinema, but on book covers and in politics. The Wanderer appears in many different guises, and in many different landscapes.
yeah, I mean, there are great essays in the catalog which take that up by you and other writers. And of course, that's just to tell people that's not part of the exhibition. The exhibition lays the groundwork, and then the book takes you beyond. It's like a great conclusion in a sense. Last scene, I promise.
It's
Quaron.
really, I think it's so great that you're bringing in all these film clips, and it's true that Friedrich certainly could not have imagined film, but I do think it's so interesting the sensitivity to the camera and the
Mm,
viewpoint through the camera that
yeah,
is inherent, intrinsic to filmmaking. And then this experience of looking that is being depicted. Friedrich is working in the same years that photography, he wouldn't have known, but photography is being developed in France and England in his lifetime. The first daguerreotypes are publicly exhibited in 1839, the year before he
right.
dies. And so there is this period interest in the eye and optics, in the philosophy of looking that I think you're kind of getting at or showing here by bringing in
Yeah.
these examples of
And
film.
I should add, it took, a certain amount of creative courage to magnify look and figure and depict them so centrally. And Friedrich was critiqued at the time,
Mm,
for showing his figures that way, because,
yeah,
just as the landscape was not supposed to be so open-ended, also, figures were not supposed to be that closed off,
right.
to a viewer. So what he did was not only innovative, but to a certain extent controversial. There was critical pushback.
Yeah. So just a little bit of a closer look at Monk by the Sea. You, of course, see
Yeah.
the monk here on the left, who's slightly off center, who has his hand to his chin in a pose of melancholia, which dates back to Durer and beyond. There's a bird here, and then there are birds taking off and flying in this direction. You see them through the scene. The wind is kind of whipping lower left to upper right. There's an opening in the clouds sort of right above him, which I read sort of symbolically. Otherwise, there's just this bank of sand and the white cap flecked sea, which his head doesn't bisect it. His head is below it, as if he's sort of immersed in its depths. But we should also note to people that something is missing that he originally had in the picture. Maybe comment about this briefly.
Joanna, do you want to talk about this one, the underdrawing?
Yeah, yeah. So it's remarkable that, Friedrich produces this large scale work with such little information in it, so few motifs. And it is something that he did begin to do in his finished drawings. But to do it in oil on such a large scale was really radical, as Alison said. But he arrived at that through this process of reduction. So he originally painted these boats in the water, and this is infrared reflectogram produced by Christina Mosel at the National Gallery in Berlin, and she's outlined the boats here. And it was Friedrich who decided to paint them out, to paint over them, effectively erasing them, and clearly realizing that by doing so, he would make a much more powerful composition. And much later in that same manuscript from around 1830, he makes this wonderful remark that, you know, an artist shouldn't force too much into a composition, that it's important to leave space for the imagination to play. And already in 1808, 1810, he kind of intuits that or figures that out in the course of painting, in the process of producing this work.
Mm. And just some details here where you can see this is not the kind of active brushwork of Delacroix and the Romantic school in France, but it's neither is it the Fini of Ingres and the neoclassicist sort of tendrils that were still going in France at the time. It's kind of a mixture of an interest in drawing. You see the little scratchy sense of brush in the dunes here, and a kind of, you know, I don't even know how to describe the way he works the clouds, because it's not the way Turner works with palette knife, etc. It's not that vibrant and sort of brushy and lusty. Instead, it's much more refined and really meant to be seen from a distance when it becomes the whole of the composition. And very difficult to photograph, I have to say, this painting. Very hard, not just because of the lighting and the glass and everything else, but just because of the way he's so subtly modulated light and form. Let's talk a little bit about the sublime. Something that comes up in Alison's essay and my essay is Robert Rosenblum, who was a professor at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, died in 2006, and his canonical text there on the right, Modern Painting and the Northern Romantic Tradition, Friedrich de Rothko, 1977, which I bought at Duke in 1987, I think, when I was taking a romantic art course, remains a kind of book that rethought the way that we consider or think about these pictures, which, of course, in 1977 were not on a pinacular level in terms of early 19th century art, the estimation of early 19th century art. But it was Rosenblum who first tried to make connections with his own period and the things that he was writing about as both a contemporary art critic and an art historian, and these paintings which he had grown to love, having traveled after the war through Germany. Maybe
Yeah,
Alison,
I think,
about that for a
yes.
second.
Yeah. So I think, you know, when Rosenblum was writing in the 70s, you know, if it's hard to overestimate how unknown Friedrich was
Yeah.
in that period. You know, this is before color reproduction was, certainly high quality color reproduction was widely available. So as much as Friedrich is unknown today, he was really unknown in this period. And Rosenblum's lectures, his book, his articles were really intended as a provocation, and really directed at the American art world, and specifically at this formalist mode of art history and art criticism. And in his book, he essentially proposes an alternative to the art historical narrative that extends from French Impressionism to Post-Impressionism to American modernism, and excludes everything else from that canon. And as a counter, he proposes this strain of romanticism, which he traces from Friedrich at one end to Rothko at the other. And Rosenblum's intention is not to demonstrate a clear art historical documentary chain of transmission, but rather to point out shared sensibilities. And through that, to also highlight the persistence of representation, the persistence of spirituality in American art, as opposed to this focus on materialism and abstraction. And it was intended as a provocation, and it was duly received as one. And it had an absolutely explosive effect on the art world for at least 2 decades afterwards. And it also introduced Friedrich into American art history in this rather unusual way, so that for many people well, a number of generations, including my own, Americans tend to come at Friedrich through this lens of abstraction and minimalism and American modernism. And so he exists for us, as he does to a certain extent in Germany, as this foundational modernist figure. And one of the things that we wanted to do in this exhibition was to take a few steps back and really to examine Friedrich's work, to display it on its own terms, in its own time, which is quite complex and rich enough, and kind of open that world up to our public so that we can then have a sort of accompanying historical background to this, as you've done here, Jason, right, to this appreciation of Friedrich as a modernist progenitor.
Yeah. And the thing to also to remember is, of course, Monk by the Sea, as you see when you go through the exhibit, is an outlier. It's a one-off. He doesn't do it. He doesn't replicate it. He doesn't, do that over and over. He repeats some formula in his artwork, but there's never anything as singularly stark as that picture. And instead, sort of, this text sort of introduced you to the rest of it and thinking about the rest of it as against a sort of slavish following of only the French avant-garde and expanding it beyond so that it encompasses many, many other artists, Nordic and Northern European, including British and Scottish, who were doing work, which now we see as freighted with psychology and emotionality and tenor and away from the kind of card-carrying historicism of some of the French artists. But just, this idea of the way that one becomes absorbed in modern art is something which has so much of its roots in that concept that you quoted, the idea of seeing things like a Droog in Clockwork Orange with your eyelids off, wide open, and just staring at something. Like that person, the writer said about Monk by the Sea on the right. This is my favorite Rothko, which is from a private collection, which was at Pace a few years ago in the late paintings, late dark paintings, and just sitting there in the gallery and watching people go through this show at Pace in Chelsea, and then all of a sudden they would hit this painting on the left and they would just stop. They would just stop, sit down. There's a bench, and gather around. It had a real effect on people. And I was trying to think about these kinds of ideas when I was writing about Monk by the Sea. I wanted to see if you bought any of this, you two, since you live with this painting. This is Boilly's fabulous, the public viewing of David's coronation at the Louvre in 1810. And I talked about the idea that this is a painting for narcissists in narcissistic, revolutionary, post-revolutionary, really empire, France. The idea of being somewhere and being seen, looking at a painting which is about the idea of being seen, the grand coronation where Napoleon has already put the crown on his own head and is now crowning Josephine by a David, massive picture, although he makes it look kind of small here, which is now in the Louvre. But I was amazed to find that this painting by Boilly, which is in the galleries at the Met, is from the exact same year as Friedrich's Monk by the Sea. They couldn't be more different in terms of the experience of the viewer in looking at these kinds of works.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting comparison, and it highlights another aspect of Friedrich's work that's very important, which is that it expands for the period the notion of what a landscape painting can be. This was a period when it was thought that important subjects, profound ideas, profound emotions were best communicated through figure painting, often on historical subjects. And Friedrich, I think, ventures an alternative. And in many ways, his whole career is an exploration of the idea of what can a landscape painting be made to evoke, what kinds of meaning, what kinds of emotions, what is the complexity of ideas that can be addressed through the depiction of light and air and topography, and he really devotes his life to expanding the expressive possibilities of those elements in the absence of figures to act out a narrative.
Right. Yeah,
This
because
is
the figures are looking at, in the French painting, it's all about the figures, and in the other, and not landscape. And even in Thomas Struth's later series of museum photographs that he does, these fabulous pictures from 1990s, a German artist who's doing these huge prints, 87 and a half inches wide. He's going to locations to look at people looking at art, but he almost never has people looking at landscape, right? Landscape paintings. They're always figurative paintings. This one from the artist of Chicago with the great Caillebotte. And I love also the detail of the Degas milliner shop on the right with all these heads, but that idea of you looking at this photograph of this woman with a stroller, which you don't even notice the first time, looking at this painting, Rainy Day in Paris, which I think is from the 1870s, or of course his image of the Wrath of Medusa by Géricault when he's looking at landscape painting, sorry, romantic paintings, it's the figural. It's like Alison's talking about, the historic landscape with bodies, the classicizing bodies, the drawn body, which is so important here. And then, of course, Struth is arranging people, tourists, in front of it to kind of mimic the composition. But I'm certain that Struth is sort of thinking about the way that Friedrich entices us to think about looking at people looking.
Well, and this is something that Friedrich himself was very attuned to. And Joanna, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. He was very attuned to his compositions, the display of his works,
Mm,
and the varying relationships that his works created with viewers, depending on the medium, depending on scale, on lighting conditions, and many other things. Joanna, did you have anything you wanted to add to
Yeah.
that?
No, I think it's a perfect way to put it that his pictures, whether there's a figure in there or not, are effectively depictions of an experience. And their work, this is quoting the work of Joseph Kerner, who wrote a wonderful book about Friedrich
yeah.
many years ago, but is also represented in our catalog, that you take the figure away from the picture, but then the composition is still framed in this very particular way that it prefigures our own viewership. So we become the Rückenfigur, and the painting is not so much a landscape as about our contemplation of it.
Mm,
And so there's this very kind of meta sort of dynamic there. But indeed, Friedrich was very sensitive to how his works were displayed. His famous painting, The Cross in the Mountains, we know he displayed in his studio in a darkened room on a kind of altar-like table, the lights low. We know a little bit about how his drawings were displayed at the Dresden Academy. He also did experiment with what are called transparent builder, kind of like the French dioramas, and included, these works don't survive, but he sent these drawings on transparent paper, and along with very detailed instructions about how they were to be displayed, with light shining both from behind and in front, but through a bowl of wine, while music was playing. So you would almost get this kind of proto-cinematic experience. So he's very, very sensitive, both, in terms of his own vantage point and the way he constructs the landscape, but then
yeah.
in thinking about how people would
Yeah.
encounter him.
And then you see that in the exhibition. I mean, there's some wonderful cutouts in the walls so that it gives you a taste of what you're going to see when you come around again. And also a place where you can rest as you're doing all these hiking through German and Swiss landscapes. But this dude here on the left, he's not on his phone. He was looking at photos that he had taken of the pictures. So he's not on a screen. And this guy, I watched him for a long time. He did not move from this spot. He's looking at, everyone can see the Wanderer above the sea of fog here, but from two galleries away, really three galleries away, and just riveted there and looking at the people. And then this terrific little view, which Alison mentioned to me, they didn't even realize would happen, that when you turn through, I think the third gallery, you see, after Monk by the Sea, the gallery after that, you turn the corner and then you see this little cutaway view of the Wanderer over the Sea of Fog, above the Sea of Fog. Amazing. I encourage people to spend some time in the gallery, not just looking at the works, but looking at people. Just we have about 11 more minutes till we lose Allison, but Joanna's sticking with us. Wander above the sea of fog. Talk about the outfit, please. It's critical.
So it's a little bit difficult to tell in reproductions, including this one, but
Mm,
he is wearing a green velvet suit, which is manifestly inappropriate for hiking, and is likely also a clue to his social status. This is something that would be worn by a relatively wealthy urbanite. So this marks him as the new type of nature tourist that arose in the period, people who are traveling through the landscape, and this, in this case, specifically in the mountains, seeking out an experience of nature. Perhaps in this case, the romantic sublime, this combination of beauty and danger that was
mm,
very sought after by the romantics. And you can see his hair is very tousled, agitated by the wind, which is also a romantic trope, right? For this sort of creative fervor, this tumult of the soul. Wanderers for the romantics were emblematic of this of a journey in nature, which is also a journey, a transformation of the self.
yeah. And the shoes. Is he wearing Merrell's, Vost? What kind of hiking boots?
I've spent, well, I'm ashamed to say how much time I've spent
Yep.
scrutinizing the Wanderer's shoes, but they're not hiking boots, and
No.
they're not the type of hiking gear that we see, for example, in some of the sketches that Friedrich and his friends did of each other on sketching expeditions. So
Yeah.
I'm stealing this from someone else. I can't now remember who to cite, but you have to picture a carriage and some horses kind of just off screen
Yeah.
here, waiting to carry him away after he's had his profound experience um,
It's interesting that
of the landscape.
the body of the figure becomes a kind of confection that there's, as is the view, because it's not a particular specific view. It's a, collage
Correct. It's an
view.
amalgamation. A
Yeah.
German that I brought through said that it's a collage of some
Mm.
of the best known rock formations in Germany. And before you
Yeah.
ask, yes, there are well-known rock formations in Germany. Every single one has its
Of
own
course.
name, its own Wikipedia page. And Friedrich has kind of stitched them all together with this
Mm.
evanescent fog. That's one of the functions of the mist in this picture.
Here's my shot from Mount Etna in 2015, January. I had a student sort of stand up a little bit higher and get a shot because this is how you think, right? Immediately. Got to get
It
this.
is. We collect
Did-
these. So we've
Yeah.
taken them, people have sent them to us um throughout the period of time that we were working on this show. It's now
Yeah.
almost become instinctive for people when they've reached some sort of summit or shore to take an
I got to
image
do it.
like
Unfortunately,
this.
my green velvet suit was at the cleaners. So,
There's
alas.
When I've been taking people through the show, I've started to take a poll and to ask people like if you only had two choices, which of course you don't only have two choices,
Yeah.
but is the Wanderer an image of man's dominance over nature or of man's smallness
Mm.
within nature? It's really interesting how divided it is. And if I did more data analysis, I could probably break it down by gender and age. But it's very interesting that the picture invites these really, really disparate interpretations.
What do they say about his images of Caroline, his wife, and pictures like this one? This is the beautiful woman at the window from 1822, which we had at the Met previously in the Rooms with a View exhibition back in 2012, maybe, or 11, 12. But this very beautiful and very incredibly organized composition of the back view of his wife.
Joanna, do you have polling data on
Not
Yeah.
this
on
or
this.
other
No, I don't have
insights?
a poll on this one. This one just kind of takes people's breath away.
Yeah.
It's a smaller painting. It's quite intimate. But it's with the exception of the monk, it's one of the first really central Rückenfiguren in
Mm.
the show. And I love that it's a woman and that it's his wife and that she's invested with such psychological interiority, you know, that there's just, you can't see her face. And precisely because of that, we imagine her having all kinds of thoughts and emotions, but we don't have access to them. And again, just as with the Wanderer, even more so, we really don't have access to what she sees, just a tiny glimpse of it. But it
There
is,
are masts. There are masts
there
in
are
the
masks.
background
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the intimation of water and also moving beyond, getting out of this domestic sphere and going elsewhere, which may be something that's limited in her sphere. But I also think it's a deeply affectionate picture, in kind of a momentary view. You notice that the vanishing point is on the left side here, not in the middle, as if he's standing to the side. He's just sort of noticed her while he's been doing something else. And also the way the light comes through her ears, the cartilage of her ears. It's that there's a real attention to detail and, this kind of thing, which is not always typical of his practice, which is to try to really make concrete a memory. I've always felt that about this picture. It's deeply affectionate.
Well, one
And
of
of
the
course, so yeah,
discoveries for me putting together
yeah,
this
go ahead, Sarah.
show was that Friedrich, in his personal life, had a very close circle of friends
Yeah.
and of family, and had a very affectionate, loving relationship with his wife, with their three surviving children. They were apparently very closely involved in his creative practice. They were
Mm.
in and out of the studio. His son trained as a painter. And I think, as you said, Jason, I think that that dimension of his life is reflected or refracted, particularly in this painting.
Yeah. And artists, of course, have keyed on in this as well. The female images, these just two examples. Hammershoy, who I know is close to Allison's heart, and Dali, Salvador Dali, this wonderful, it's not even surrealism, it's his more like his early realism painting, women looking out the window. Uh, there are many examples. I think these are two of the best.
Yeah,
Uh,
this is another motif that really gets picked up and acquires a
yeah,
life of its own, as Sabina's exhibition, Rooms with a View, so beautifully demonstrated.
yeah.
It, turns up in Friedrich's work and is then cited and repeated in the work of his contemporaries and sort of diffuses outwards, and I think continues to have, a vibrant afterlife.
Hmm. And lest you think all the images of Rückenfigure in women are these sort of claustral, contained scenes of longing, I show you this, which is one of the great revelations of the exhibit. Not that we didn't know it, just had never seen it. Woman before the rising or setting sun. So here, please tell us definitively, is it sunrise or is the sun setting? I know what it is
So
myself.
this is another one where I would like to get Joanna's polling
Yeah.
data. There is a major divide in the Caspar David Friedrich scholarship over whether this
Hmm.
is a setting sun or a rising sun, and people have analyzed the colors of the sky. I met with a scholar recently, who thinks that this actually reflects the colors of the European skies after a volcanic
Yep.
eruption in the South Seas.
Yep.
But no one, I think, has definitively answered the question, and therefore there's two varying interpretations of the painting. If it's a setting sun, if you think it's a setting sun, then it's a painting about death and mortality. If it's a rising sun, then you think it's a painting about birth.
Hmm.
For me, I think that, to me, the more interesting aspect of the picture is this quality of indeterminacy, which is something that Friedrich loves. He loves these transitional moments of the day, of the year. Is it sunrise? Is it sunset? Is it one or the other or both? I think that becomes then, this is an open question. This speaks to the
Yeah.
open-endedness of his work and the fact that it can sustain, these different interpretations,
Yeah.
different emotional responses.
Okay, so that's a hedge. So what is it, Joanna? I'm joking. What is it?
Well, I was going to answer the same way, of course.
Ah,
But
okay.
I guess if I had to say, if I had to pick one,
You have to.
I would say sunset.
Okay.
Set.
Interesting.
You?
I think it's sunrise because the way her hands are, which is in the position of St. Francis receiving the stigmata. Now that the Frick is reopened, people can go see the Bellini. That never happens at sunset. It's always the sort of rising early in the day. He's come out of his cave and she has her hands open like this. But who knows? The wonderful things are the earrings, which everyone should go look at, and the sort of spiky Statue of Liberty. What is it on her head? It's a bonnet?
It's a hair comb that's
Hair
keeping
comb.
her hair in place.
Fabulous. Go check it out. And of course, these lurking rocks, which have a significance in Friedrich's art. I only have three more slides. The greatest female Rückenfigure figure in American art is, of course, Andrew Wyatt's Christina's World at MoMA, stupidly not up right now. This painting should always be up. Maybe it's on loan. That's a possibility. But my father, tribute to my father, who just did a paper on it for his continuing ed class up in Western Mass. But this picture, which has always astonished audiences, this image of Christina Olsen in rural Maine or coastal Maine, and that sense of her, looking up this hill, spectacular tempera painting by Wyeth from 1948. We don't need to talk about it, but just go see it when it's back. And one last Rukin figure from popular culture, and then we'll let Alison go. White Lotus. Can't avoid White Lotus, but the concluding scene in the final episode of the third and I think best season of White Lotus shows Jason Isaacs, the great Duke graduate, on shipboard looking towards the sun setting, rising, unclear, on ship. And of course, it immediately made me think of, I started jumping up from the couch, Friedrich's Beautiful, not in the exhibition because of issues with Russian collections, but it was in New York at the Met in 1990 at the great show of Friedrich and the Lehman Wing, which first got me stimulated by the artist, all the works from Russian collection that Robert Rosenblum actually worked on that catalog, and Sabine also, and this beautiful image of, I think, the painter, right, and his wife, maybe, unclear, but this medieval outfit on shipboard with a similar kind of color scheme. Mike White knows his art history clearly. Making the White
Yes.
Lotus
So,
belong.
and I would say, as my parting note before I have to exit stage left,
Mm,
is so it is great fun to find Friedrichs, whether in popular culture or out in the natural world. What I was also drawn to do in the process of putting this show together, looking closely at Friedrich's works, I found also led me to look much more closely at the landscape around me.
yeah.
And I take much more notice now of the qualities of the light, the qualities of the clouds, the states of blooming of the
Mm,
various trees, and not in a utopian way, right? Because we live in a very urban environment, as Friedrich did too. But I think his works also can draw us back into nature, and into ourselves, in a very lovely way. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the conversation. And I'm going to ruthlessly abandon Joanna to handle all of your
she's in
hard-hitting
good hands. We'll be
questions. So
fine.
thank you, Jason. Thank
Thank
you
you,
to everyone
Allison.
at the Brooklyn Whale. And please come see the show.
Thank you so much,
All
Allison. It's been great
right.
working with you.
Bye-bye.
So, Joanna, I'm showing here, as you can see, the last sort of not the last view of the show because you come around this room and you see all these wonderful drawings. I'll show one in a second. But when you turn around to leave, you notice this
Mhm.
picture on
Yeah.
its own sort of floating wall. This which kind of closes it. These two images, A Walk at Dusk from the Getty, which I believe, am I right? Is that the first Friedrich to enter a U.S. collection? No, the
No, that was
second after Fort Worth,
Kimball
after the
in
Kimball, yeah.
1980, and then yeah.
And then Moonrise here on an empty shore with one of these magnificent rocks that he loves so much
Hmm.
from 1835 to 38. So maybe talk a little bit about the way that you very beautifully and sensitively ended the exhibition.
So, well, it's fascinating. Friedrich spends the last few years of his career returning to ink wash, the medium with which he had really launched his career, as we were talking about earlier, working on a smaller, more intimate scale, but revisiting a lot of the motifs that had been important to him throughout his career. But he does it seems he stops making oil paintings around 1835, in
Mm.
which year he did have a stroke, and we know that he experienced at least some temporary paralysis of his hand. Though when you look at the drawings that are known to have been made after that point, you can see he regains an extraordinary degree of dexterity.
Mm.
Though it may well have been difficult to work on a large scale. And so that Getty picture is actually quite small,
Yeah.
and probably a little bit earlier. But, it's thought that it's a kind of quasi self-portrait, not a Rückenfigur, now actually seen in profile. So you can kind of see him looking down and kind of inward. And what is before him is a dolmen, a prehistoric rock formation that was then certainly and even now still thought to be, a kind of ancient grave marker, a tomb. Um, and so we have a figure, an aging artist before a kind of grave, but also one with political associations and significance, because these prehistoric um, structures were taken in this time of aspiration, unfulfilled aspiration for a unified Germany grounded in democratic principles, as a kind of symbol of indigenous German past, a kind of construction of a German past and pan-German identity. And it may be this is Friedrich also mourning those dashed hopes by this point. Um, it's also
Did he get in any trouble for doing all these images of these men in medieval dress that had a kind of radical aspect?
Yeah, so indeed this dress, this kind of medieval style dress, became very popular in the post-Napoleonic War years among like liberal student groups, such that
Mm.
it was even banned for a period.
Right.
So this interest in a unified Germany bumped up against aristocratic power and interests, which won out for a very long time. And so yeah, so it was banned. But then Friedrich continues to incorporate it into his paintings.
Yeah.
There was uh he did get into some trouble indeed. Nothing he couldn't get out of, but indeed, and he even wrote about one of his pictures, where figures are wearing this kind of dress as two men plotting democratic intrigues.
Right.
It is unclear how if that was in jest or not, but yeah, no, it was not entirely a controversial stance, but some of the activity around it could be. And so he was facing really quite, a kind of repressive regime in many respects. But what's also interesting to me is that it becomes such an important motif in his work. So it shows up. He first draws this specific rock formation in 1802. He then incorporates it into some of his early paintings. And then in the reception piece he submits to the Dresden Academy around 1820, where it's really like the center of the picture. And it's to me a very bold move to submit as your reception piece a painting of a giant rock, is what it looks like at first glance. But of course, it's a natural motif in which ancient history is embedded, death, mourning, these big, big ideas. And
Yeah.
so I think it is making that point Alison mentioned earlier, that it's showing landscape as having the capacity, and perhaps even the greatest capacity, to say and suggest very profound things. So in a way, I like to interpret this painting possibly, if it is indeed a self-portrait, as Friedrich, and also kind of looking back on his own work and his career, and maybe also
Mm.
thinking a bit about his posterity. And then in the drawing, in the ink wash drawing, it's not a dolmen per se, though it certainly has a similar shape, and certainly reminds us of this dolmen he loved to depict. But now a place on an empty shore, a rock that has been there for billions of years potentially, and you know very much still static, enduring, as the the tides go back and forth, the moon rises, the sun, rises and sets, those cycles of nature that this form has witnessed countless times. And this is a period when people are more widely embracing the idea that the earth is very, very old and that human existence is just a tiny fraction of
Yeah.
that almost, impossibly large expanse of time. And so I sort of think of these late drawings as, landscapes. They could be primordial landscapes. They could be set into the distant
Right.
future. And were maybe meant not to know. It's meant to be, it's always something a little bit beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, that's the quietude of the sublime, which he gets so well in his small pictures. And I just want to reiterate something that Allison said before she left, that idea that you look at these works and they're small and you have to concentrate and you leave with a kind of heightened awareness. I mean, it's related to the idea of the picturesque in the 18th century, that you go out then into nature and you see things which remind you of a picture, or that is a romantic conceit, but also the way that filmmakers do that as well. Sometimes, especially when you go see a day movie and you come out blinking into the light and your senses are charged up. Like I think of movies by Terrence Malick or Eric Zonka, great French director of Dream Life of Angels. Whenever I see any of their films, you sort of come out and you notice sounds in a different way. You see things in a different way. Friedrich has that effect. I mean,
Yeah.
he might have been a great filmmaker
Yeah.
if science had not failed him and he had died in 1840.
Yeah.
So, with that, we conclude this part of the NSE. Thank you so much, Joanna. And I'm going to turn it over to Magli, who I'm sure has some questions from the large audience for you, and I can help also. But go ahead, Magli.
Thank you so much, Jason and Joanna. This was such a lovely conversation. We do have a few audience member questions. The first is from an anonymous audience member who says, can you share more about the lighting and the viewing environment Friedrich envisioned and whether they were a consideration during the exhibition design?
Thank you for that question. So we only have, little glimpses, a little bit of, you know, suggestions of how things were hung, and lit, so certain works he wrote in detail or critics remarked in detail. And certainly he was very keen, because there's no electricity, no electric lighting. But he clearly, based on those instances, he was very sensitive to lighting impacting how one views a work of art. And in terms of the exhibition design, certainly we shared that kind of information with our designers. We did not want to try to do a kind of faux period kind of
Yeah.
environment, but we're in a museum, and there's certain restrictions anyway, and just kind of embrace the kind of modernity of his works, and have a kind of modern feeling space, but then working with our designers on choosing just the right wall colors to make the works look their best. And then our lighting designer did incredible magic, because indeed some of the works required incredibly low light levels. And so she managed to achieve those light levels while making everything still legible, and but it does create a kind of glowing, kind of hushed atmosphere that I do think Friedrich would have approved of.
I have to say myself, I find the lighting a little too yellow, but that is often the case in museum shows. Personally, is my one
Hmm.
critique. There's a picture of him by Kirsting painting. Of course, he painted by daylight, and I've always sort of try to encourage people to use daylight, white light in these shows. But I understand why it keeps the light levels low, and of course, you're dealing with sensitive papers and other things. There are many, many considerations. It's very different from when you go see the Sargent show, which opens this week, the way that that's lit, big galleries, big rooms, bright lights, spotlighting, that kind of thing. That's not the sensation they're going for at the Met.
Yeah, we wanted something but fairly neutral in tone,
Yeah.
but and with something that captured the mood of his works, but also didn't dominate it. So as we say, we tried to make every decision was geared towards trying to make the show look like we took a very light touch, but of course that was the result of an extraordinary amount of work and number of conversations.
Thank you for those answers. Another question from GE. GE says, how is that though there's no architecture, no eaves, no apertures, we are yet enclosed by the enormity of openness, cathedrals not made by hands, but by vacancy? Thank you.
Mm. Well, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. I hope I'm understanding fully, but I think the Friedrich was and his contemporaries were super interested in the idea of natural architecture, mountains, rock formations, in part as the most obvious kind of visual manifestations of the age of the earth, but also because they look, in a way like human man-made structures in some cases. But he was also very interested. He did depict ruins frequently and was very interested in showing the degradation of these built forms because of of time and weather and sometimes human destruction too. And so the way that human construction, ambition, and history intersects with the broader rhythms of nature is a real core element of his work. But that was really beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is from an anonymous audience member. And they ask, can you discuss the importance of lyrical ballads, specifically Wordsworth and Coleridge on landscape painting?
Oh, that's so interesting. So if I
But
my British literary history correct, that's a little bit later or like overlapping with Friedrich's lifetime. My take, though, Jason, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that they are responding to, reading and absorbing some of the same uh, philosophical ideas that Friedrich and his contemporaries are aware of and immersed in. So that not to make too linear a kind of history, but that early Romantic literature emerges in the late 18th century and is in largely in the German lands, but spreads really widely, including to England and eventually to the young United States. But what am I missing, Jason?
yeah, and I'm sure they're all reading Virgil and Longinus and
True,
Horace, all
true.
these things. They're sort of coming out of the same place. But I don't think people in Germany are reading British Romantic poets yet. It's too
I
early.
don't, yeah, I think it's
Too early.
going in the other direction, at least until
Yeah.
pretty late in Friedrich's career.
Thank you for those answers. Janice is wondering what you all think about there being a through line connection with Hockney's splash painting with the pool splash, like the fog.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that one. Hockney. Yeah. I mean, um, I don't know I don't know a great deal
Got to
about
go to Paris to
Hockney's
find
work.
out.
Yeah. Um,
Massive Hockney exhibition in Paris right now. I mean, maybe that has all the answers. Certainly, he's an artist who's obsessed by the picturesque, no question. Hockney in his whole career, in his entire
mhm.
career.
And certainly you see that sensitivity to vantage point and his use of
Yeah.
color also. There are a lot of nice connections. And Hockney's an artist who, you know, certainly could have, thanks in large part to Robert Rosenblum's book, been familiar with Friedrich's work. But that's an interesting question, one that, yeah, it's worth some further consideration.
And then There is a viewer from Chicago who says, "Thank you, I joined late, but has there been any context relative to art song of the time, specifically Schubert's songs, The Winter Wreath, where the wanderer is the protagonist?"
Yeah, absolutely. So right in the same period, Schubert composes the Winterreise, Winter's Journey, and the idea of a journey of a wanderer is a kind of expression of some of the same ideas that Friedrich's exploring pictorially. Friedrich is also very interested in the season of winter, certainly in transitions, but also in winter itself as a season that kind of brings together associations of death and rebirth. And so in terms of a direct connection, nothing is really known, but they, very likely were aware of each other on some level. And then certainly the tradition of Lieder, of art songs and poems set to music, was a strong one and a vibrant one. And there are works, particularly late works by Friedrich, that do have certainly at least similar themes and a similar kind of conception of the self and the world that are expressed in many of those leader of the period. I think Friedrich, we have no record of his library, but I think he was a reader early in his career. He does make some literary illustrations, and he's very much, part of the fabric of the cultural circles in Dresden. He's quite a well-connected artist. And part of the vanguard of Romanticism. What he does, how he expresses romantic ideas is extremely distinctive. But they are ideas that are, very much of the moment that a lot of people are exploring in different forms.
Yeah, I recommend getting the Winterreise on your AirPods or your Spotify, especially in the room with all the winter landscapes. I did it. It's fantastic.
That's so nice.
Fabulous experience. Yeah.
Thank you. The last question is going to come from Fong, but Jason, do you mind stopping your screen share for a second?
Sure. I just have to, I'll come back to it when we do the poem. Okay.
Okay. And then Fong, I will give you a chance to unmute.
But you have to make it the speaker visible, not me.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. It's a great show. I saw it twice already,
Thank you.
and I don't think we'll likely have a chance to see a show like this again. But I'm sorry I missed some of the talks, the segment of the talk. But I wanted to ask, since we just curated our show at Anton Kern, it's called Love Poems, but it's really about the dark vein romanticism in America, mostly explored by, Hawthorne, Melville, continued to Allan Poe, to Southern Gothic, Faulkner's and Flannery O'Connor and others. And I've been rethinking about the counter-enlightenment because, as you know, Immanuel Kant criticized all of his friends for always proposing vague idealism, rhapsodical notion about man in relation to nature. After all, he's able to bring together the, European rationalism and that of the British common sense, empiricism. So he's very assured that there can be a synthesis. So he really detests all of his friends, but he was so critical of them that he became them. That's a central of my reading at the moment. There's actually a legendary 6 lectures that were delivered at the Mellon Lecture at the National Gallery of Art in 1965 by Sir Isaiah Berlin. It's called The Roots of Romanticism. It's fantastic. a year before, 64 was the year that Sobello published Herzog. You remember Moses Herzog? If you read in the book, it begins with the famous line, "If I'm out of my mind, it's okay with me." You know, it's so interesting in regard to he was so critical of them. So which bring to my Johann Gottfried Herder,
Mm.
who was probably 20 years or 18 years older than Friedrich, Caspar David Friedrich, but he invented the terms called Volksgeist, means German people, and this is a time when Germany was not created. It used to be the Great Prussia. So it's important to figure out that what that meant is give them an identity, meaning the German folklores, food, song, dances, could only be made by German people, no
Mm.
one else's. So the misreading could be easily slipped right into that dark vein romanticism, because right now we are moving into the swing towards nationalist tendency.
Yeah. Oh, I think you might have wrote. Oh no. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. So yes, so such a rich comment. So yes, I think it's important to discuss and acknowledge that of what unfolds in Germany in the following century is of course National Socialism, the rise of the Nazi Party, the Holocaust, World War II. And although Friedrich lived and worked, 100 years earlier, there is that proto-nationalism. And it would be a mistake to say, well, it had absolutely nothing to do with what comes later, right? Because that's not how history works. And it's not like ethnocentrism didn't exist in the 19th century. It very much did.
Yeah.
Friedrich, as far as we know, didn't harbor ethnocentric views. He was very anti-French because of the Napoleonic Wars. But we can't ignore that possibility. And it's something we discuss at some length in the exhibition catalog. But indeed, there was no Germany. It was a constellation of separate aristocratic territories, among them Prussia. And so it was more of a question, an open-ended question of like, what does it mean to be German, and what is German identity? But then there were people in that period who did answer that question in some pretty disturbing ways. And of course their worldview is a white Christian one, and a largely male one. And so it was very important to us to acknowledge that in our book. And then it's very interesting though what you say about the romanticism as being sort of counter Enlightenment, because of course it is seen generally as a reaction against rationalism and the objective, scientific, towards something more elusive and harder to pin down, emotional, spiritual, folly, being of interest. And then to see how the how then that is both of those things feed into or are ingredients in or can be weaponized towards supremacy, a kind of problematic political stance. One is not innocent and the other's guilty. It's much more complicated. But I think for Friedrich, he was very much interested in a unified Germany. He, having grown up during the, American Revolution and then French Revolution, he was part of this generation who did absorb certain, at least ostensibly, democratic ideals, and was hoping for a kind of democratic nation state, and which obviously did not come.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking in a broader sense too, because it's very perplexing to think that someone like Emerson, when he with others Morgan Fuller and Thoreau created the Transcendental Club in the 1840s, just right to the tail end of Jacksonian America. It's so interesting to think how much he was absorbing transcendental idealism. And self-reliance is basically based on also the constant friction between the creator and the person. And I think I'm so compelled by it, because when someone like, Elon Musk is scientifically, inventively brilliant, but as a person, he's dark. Remember when he jumped up and he's called, I'm Dark Maga? That split is so intense. And I'm thinking about where and how we can sometimes need to rethink very carefully, thoughtfully about the separation of the dualism in artists too. It exists in the creative. And how it's read, how it's interpreted, is beyond their control, So that's my thinking. But listen, the show is amazing, because it's proven to you that sublimity, return to nature, the lack of the emphasis of the self, is the service to the art.
Thank you for that.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Jason. And yeah, I mean, I need to re-listen to the whole thing. It's so rich. Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations. Back to you, Mackley.
Thank you for that question, Fong. We're going to close out with a poem. You can go ahead and reshare your screen, Jason.
So I want to close with a poem, but just say thank you so much, Joanna. That was wonderful. And thank you to Alison, wherever she may be. Just great fun for me to do this, and to celebrate an artist that's, very deeply important to us, really, and that, it's a miracle that we have it. And people should know this is a one venue show. It's not going anywhere else. This is it. It's one of the reasons why we're in New York. We get to see this stuff. How many works, by the way, does the Met own? The one painting and then
one drawing, and then we own 6 prints by him.
6 prints. But yeah. So there's the one painting, the 2 men staring at the moon, which we didn't show, but it's there. I encourage everyone to go see it. So I thought today I'd read Matthew Arnold's great Dover Beach to inject a little Victorianism into this. Arnold, it's also appropriate because obviously it's a seaside subject, but he also wrote it on his honeymoon in 1851, which is connected to Friedrich because so much of the art that he produced once he got married came out of his travels for his honeymoon around Gogh and northern Germany. Dover Beach. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast, the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling. At their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin, with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once, too, at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused arms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. I want to put that out to Pope Francis, who of course just passed away largely enlightened Pope, great Argentina football fan. He will be missed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And Magley, you can take us out.
Thank you so much, Jason, Allison, and Joanna. And thank you, Sarah, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for your support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Maggie Nelson and Darcy Stinky for a conversation on Maggie's recent publication, Pathamata, or The Story of My Mouth. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.
It was a beautiful,
so much.
Everyone.
Great
Thanks
job,
so
Thanks
much.
Jason.
for coming.
conversation.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you,
Jason. Thank you, Joanna.
Long for your
Really good,
questions.
Wanda.
Thanks to my
Enjoyed it.
parents for showing up and
Thank you
Stephen
so
Hammond,
much.
Share.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Massachusetts
Thank you.
contingent.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Magley, and
lecturing
thank
some
you
of the
again,
stuff.
Joanna.
Thank you.
Chloe.
Thanks,
Everybody.
Jason. Thanks, Mark. Thanks,
Everyone
everybody.
get out there.